Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a very special episode here at Toilets and Titles. It's Sean and I. Sean, who goes by @Mandarin 554. I'm sorry, 5447. Sean, how's it going, my friend?
Pretty good.
All right, we are joined by a very special guest. It is Dennis Michaelson, and he is of @DMIC Media, and he's also of @SCI or SCI_FF. Dennis, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me on, guys.
No, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us. We're dying to dive into Dennis's specialty here, and we this is as Sean was explaining to me earlier today, we're kind of launching like this new series of episodes. We're going to dive into the science of fantasy football, and the perfect guest to jump this off with is Dennis Michaelson. So that's why we reached out to him. Just give me 1 second. Let me just get the bells and the whistles out of the way real quick. Everyone, just a friendly reminder, if you can. You can follow the show at Apple Podcast, YouTube, Facebook, Podbean, Spotify, and Twitter. And we've got When a Family Breaks, or Twitch, I should say. When a Family Breaks is our other Facebook page. We have Toilets and Titles, and we have When a Family Breaks, which is our Facebook page dedicated to the trading of sports memorabilia, which I love. You should check it out as well. If you go to our patreon.com/Toilets and Titles, you can learn how you can further support the show. We've got a few different tiers. Of course, it comes with different types of rewards that we can provide for you. Check it out. It helps us out a lot. If you choose to go with the $1 million tier, I will take you out for a steak dinner personally with me. And it's really going to be on you anyway because you're donating $1 million, but we'd really appreciate it. Maybe I'll take you to a free Giants game as well, too, because I'm a Giants fan. Unfortunately, they've been really bad. And also our really great website, toiletsandtitles.com. It has all of our stuff, videos, articles. We have NFL fantasy content, also NCAA content as well. We've been pumping out a lot of that. We have a crew of guys working on that. We're up to like 18 members here at Toilets and Titles now. So we're all bringing different stuff, whether it's videos, articles, everything. Sean's case, he's bringing tons of articles and videos, as you can see, because he's here with us right now. So check it out. It's got everything. And one last friendly reminder, if you can, hit that like button. And if you can, just go to Apple, give us a 5-star Apple review. It really helps us out a lot. Helps us get our metrics up and really helps us out a lot. And when we get this back up here, and let's continue, Dennis Michaelson. So my friend, how's everything going? If you can start off just telling us a little bit about yourself and, how long you've been playing fantasy football and how you started really getting into the stats and analytics and science behind it.
Well, first of all, again, thank you so much for having me on. I do feel it's kind of fitting as you head into the science of fantasy football to have one of the two members of the scienceoffantasyfootball.com website to join you. We started that podcast when we were back at Fake Pigskin, and with the death of the pig, we were just kind of homeless for a little while and kind of built our own home, showing you all the work that goes on behind the scenes. So it's a little messy over there, but it is messy in any laboratory for scientists as well. But I got my start playing fantasy football probably a lot farther back than just about anybody else, because a lot of folks don't realize that fantasy football, in a weird way, did exist all the way back in the 1970s when my buddies and I invented a game called Fantasy Six Packs. There were six of us. We picked six players, and we were teenagers who couldn't drink beer, so we kind of called it Fantasy Six Packs. And we had a great deal of fun doing that all through junior high and high school. And it was just kind of a way to have fun and to kind of bust each other's chops on who knew more about football than the other guy. And, you throw your bucks in at the beginning of the week and somebody came home with $30 whole at the end. But back in the 70s, that was actually worth something. So it was a lot of fun, but low risk and just a lot of fun to play. But we only counted touchdowns. That's all we counted. We
got to start somewhere.
Yeah, you had no clue of how detailed things would get. But later on, I actually started playing my first fantasy football home league in the early 90s with a bunch of friends. We moved into a new community, met some football fanatics, and we formed league. One of our members was actually kind of famous because he's the father of the inventor of Jimmy John's sandwich shops. So we had kind of a semi-famous member. His dad was with us for quite a few years, but uh,
Yeah.
with the advent of the internet, the leagues, of course, went from just being a couple of home leagues to being quite a few leagues, and just the addiction sort of took over as well.
Oh yeah.
The hobby of chasing fantasy football. Everybody wants to try to figure out how to be better at this game than the other folks. But I started D Mike Media, my brand, back in 2018 when I was deciding that I was going to go back into doing a lot of sports media coverage. I had been a meteorologist for a long time and got laid off in 2002, formed a company called Race Talk Radio, which covered auto racing of all kinds, and traveled all over the country doing play-by-play of races from everywhere, from Canada all the way down to Texas and all the way across to the East Coast. So it was a lot of fun. Didn't make a lot of money, but met a lot of interesting people. But I did do a lot of media coaching for a lot of clients along the way,
Huh.
and turned that into a business of coaching some young athletes and young racers. I've got one player in the D League for NBA right now that I helped coach how to talk, and I've got several racers up in NASCAR, IndyCar, and NHRA that I worked with when most of them I worked with when they were teenagers, and a few executives that I won't mention by name because they'd be embarrassed. They didn't know how to talk on radio and TV either. But it turned into a pretty good business. And when I was kind of getting away from the Race Talk Radio brand and realizing that
Yeah.
racing wasn't going to cut it for a business anymore, I morphed into covering a little bit of everything. And that's how the D Mike Media brand was born. And I mentioned Science of Fantasy Football, brand new. We're just kicking the rust off the old
Okay.
page there. But we were both Professor John Bush and I were with Fake Pigskin. John was there for quite a few years longer than I was, but I was there the last 3 seasons with them. And I actually got my first writing gig with a website called, what was the original Fantasy Gauntlet. I think there's another Fantasy Gauntlet out there right now. But this one was formed back in the late 90s, at the
Hmm.
beginning days of internet coverage when I still had to have that nasty AOL sound to connect. But been covering fantasy football forever is the long and short story of it.
It what? Oh, I'm sorry, Sean. Go ahead.
So when essentially the question that I have is if you were a beginner, so you've been playing fantasy football now since the late 70s, 45 or so years, what would be the one tip or the couple tips that you would give a beginner getting into analytics? Because when you dive headfirst into fantasy football Twitter, you're going to hear a lot of acronyms and a lot of stats, most of which are sort of cherry picked or used for a purpose of actually trying to prop up a player as opposed to giving you the entire picture. What would be the things that you would tell a beginner? What would be the first couple of steps to get into analytics?
That is a great question,
Yeah.
and
So it
there's
is.
two pieces of advice that I will give as somebody who's been chasing fantasy football projections for over 35 years now. I can tell you that year-end stats are very deceiving, and I have angered quite a few people by saying year-end stats are also lazy stats because they're handpicked for you, they're delivered to you, and that's great. But the one piece of advice that I would give to novices is don't chase the points, chase the volume. Because volume is what creates points, but you can see the volume about to happen before you can see the fantasy football points starting. And the number, the next piece of advice that I have is do not worry if you are wrong according to the consensus that is out there because the consensus in sports is often wrong. And I learned this sort of the hard or the easy way, depending on your point of view, because I grew up as the son of a horse race track fan. And at the horse race track, people are betting their money on outcomes of races. And the consensus is called the favorite. The person that the horse that the most money has on it is the lowest odds, and he's called the favorite. You know, the favorite loses 2 out of every 3 races. So the consensus is wrong almost 67% of the time when people are putting their money on the line to determine an outcome of an event. And forecasting fantasy football is no different than forecasting anything. I was a weather forecaster professionally for 25 years. Weather is data. Data is what makes up fantasy football. They all go together. Anytime you are trying to predict the future, you are going to be wrong to a certain point. You're never going to be perfect with your forecast. I used to have weather forecasting clients where we'd tell them that the severe thunderstorm was going to hit them at 3:45 p.m. and they'd get upset when it hit at 3:43. 2 minutes off and they'd be upset. And we're giving them this forecast a day ahead of time. In fantasy football, nobody's going to pick exactly how many points Cooper Kupp is going to score this year. Nobody's going to be right on the money. But if you're better than consensus, you are going to make a fortune in fantasy football. So for newcomers to the game, I would suggest every week, just as an exercise, look at your team that you have of players and look at the available players on the waivers and see who got some volume, who got the most carries and targets. I call them opportunities for running backs. I don't look at the total touches. I look at targets plus carries equals opportunity. And for wide receivers, obviously look at the same, but unless you have a Deebo Samuel who carries the ball a lot, you're mainly looking at targets there. But look at your team. Look at how consistently they get targets from one week to the next. And if you're not seeing your guys get the opportunities, if you're seeing somebody else on that real football team that they play for getting more of the targets, more of the opportunities, it's time to pivot to another player. But by charting that data, you will learn a lot because chasing volume pays off in fantasy football. Chasing points never does.
So you see a lot within our space, particularly about people sort of what we would consider fading a volume, what they would consider a volume dependent player. So one of the biggest examples is Najee Harris. This particular year, Najee Harris being volume dependent because he was below four yards per carry last year. As a fantasy owner, does that give you any pause because you're looking for volume, that they're volume dependent in case the volume were to decrease year over year, because that can be volatile depending on switches in the offense.
Absolutely, but you look at the roster, okay, and you look at who's going to compete for targets or for opportunities with a particular player. In the case of Najee Harris, you got Benny Snell and you got Jeremy McNichols that they signed, and you got some undrafted free agent that nobody's ever heard of and that I can't even remember his name right now because he's just a dream of maybe catching on to the roster. So I don't look at anybody threatening Najee Harris for volume. And then I also look at the coach's tendency. Is this a coach that likes to Belichick you? Or is this a coach that likes to lean on one particular running back? And in the case of the coaching in Pittsburgh, it's been stable for quite a few years. And when he's got a healthy back, he will ride that healthy back. And there were only 2 players that really got the volume to that same level last year. It was Jonathan Taylor, who was the RB1 of the whole wide world, and it was Najee Harris. After that, you have to drop down about 50 opportunities all the way down to Antonio Gibson, who might not get that volume this year.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at Najee Harris versus what he did last year, you look at the available players that could take opportunities away from him versus an Antonio Gibson who got solid volume last year, But now look at the players that are competing for volume on that team. He is one I'd be a little bit worried of dropping some of the volume versus Najee Harris.
Yeah, those trends and coaching really means a lot to me when I'm evaluating who I'm going to take. Because I myself, I mean, I'm not in as many leagues. I keep it to 5 fantasy leagues a year, and that's it. And that's really all my bandwidth will allow for. I know there are people who are. I think Sean's a lot more than that. And but I do like I don't worry too much about what I'm seeing. I've got my big board set up, of course, and whatever Yahoo or whoever, and I'm looking at that. But I've definitely got people ahead or behind of who that consensus is, because I definitely it's very important to me who the coach is, who are they, what's their philosophy, their offensive philosophy. If it's are they a run heavy team? Do they like to use their tight ends in the passing game? Do they have are the tight ends like really that are they capable of succeeding in an offense like that? So that is something that's very important to me. That when I'm just looking at strict rankings, in my own mind, I'm definitely shifting things around as well. Um,
And one other piece of advice I have for the newer player, and this isn't for the first year player necessarily, but for somebody who's been playing less than 5 years or even less than 10 years, challenge yourself with a new style of league every year. So instead of just playing redraft, try one dynasty league. If you've got time for a few redraft leagues, you got time for one dynasty league, because Dynasty teaches you rosters a lot better than Redraft does. So as you get into your redraft season where running backs start falling by the wayside and going on IR, you already know who the second and third option are for any particular team. And what I like to do a lot of in redraft is I like to do running back hoarding. So I like to have as many running backs on my roster because I won't find as many good ones of those as I will plug and play wide receivers or a tight end in a bye week or even a quarterback that I need in a streaming situation on a bye week. I won't find running backs as easy as I'll find wide receivers and tight ends. Every week, the big bidding, if you're in a league that does the free agent bidding instead of just position waivers, is running backs. So last year I was grabbing the running backs a week before they were needed. And so I would end up with guys that were the backup to the backup. And then when guys got hurt, you were already ready. Everybody would be like, oh, so and so is going to go for a lot of FAAB this week. And I like, not in my league. He's already on the back of my roster. But those are the advices that I give is to newer players, meaning less than 5 years, challenge yourself with something different. If you always play one quarterback, play Superflex, because Superflex will teach you different strategies than just playing in the same old league. Plus, it keeps it fresh. So I like to play a little bit of redraft. I like to play a lot of bit of best ball. I've got probably 18 dynasty leagues of some type going. I got a couple of keeper leagues out there. It is hard to manage all of it. You got your priorities of which leagues you care about more, i.e., the higher money leagues. But for a newer player, I just suggest keep it small. Play a lot of best balls though, because best balls are better than mock drafts. They will, you can literally find best ball drafts for $1 or $3 or $5, and I would do 10 of those before I do my redraft home league because you'll get a real good sense for the average draft position, how it might vary with some of the players that are in your home league versus what your home league's website is telling you that ADP might be.
and how much stock do you take into consensus at all? I assume, like you've got your big board up there. Do you have like when you're drafting for, through Yahoo or Sleeper or any other draft site, do you've got like your own big board reference that that you're using from? Do you have something set up your own, like your own Dennis big board that you have set up, or do you just go, you got all right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I keep a clipboard with what I call my position scarcity index. football
Hmm.
guys are years ago started something called value-based drafting, and it really revolutionized the way people looked at the positions and when to switch from one position to the next. I've taken it to another level because all of my value based drafting, which I call position scarcity, is based on my weekly value statistical tool, which combines big game ability and consistency in fantasy
Hmm.
football because year end points don't matter because we're not playing rotisserie baseball style football leagues. What matters is what a guy does on a weekly basis. So I use this illustration because I hear a lot of people say, well, what about points per game? Doesn't that matter? And I'm like, yes, but only if you calculate it the right way. Because if I've got a running back, a backup running back, like Alexander Madison, for instance, or Herbert over with Chicago, if they get one offensive snap and that's all they get, of course, they're getting maybe 5 to 10, but that's still not enough to count it as a full game. So points per game becomes skewed for those players. The other problem with points per game is I'll do a simple math test for you. So 20 plus 1 plus 20 plus 1 is what? 42 points, right? 10 and a half points per game. That's equal to 10, 10, 10, and 12. So who would you rather have on your team? Would you rather have the guy that scores 21 week, then you're like, oh, this guy is going to be great, and he scores one, and then he scores one again, and you're like, well, screw this guy, I'm getting him out of my lineup. And then he blows up for 20 on you. So you don't get all of the benefit of those big weeks in redraft because a lot of times you're looking at him, the guy, and going, I don't want 1 point again. I'm getting him out of my lineup. And then he goes off for a big game. So that's the problem with points per game. What I invented is something called weekly values. I call it best 10. I call it that because we were sitting around the radio station up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was getting ready to do a NASCAR segment. We were tired of talking about NASCAR off the air, so we were talking about fantasy football drafts. Big sports geeks up there. Steve Zotke and Radio Joe. And Radio Joe said, I don't want that guy. He's probably going to be an injury concern. And I said two things to him. I said, Radio Joe, if you are really good at predicting injuries, you're probably good at picking lottery numbers too. So give me those winning lottery numbers for next week in advance. And the second thing I said was, I said, I'd rather have a great player for 10 games than an average player for 16. And all of a sudden the light bulb went off. And I said, what if I compare the best 10 games over the last 2 years that every player had? And that's how I developed my weekly values. I then take the weekly values, I make it according to how much the rules are, how many wide receivers I have to start, how many running backs, how many quarterbacks, and that develops a position scarcity index. That's my cheat sheet. So I've got my ranking of players, but you have to pay attention to consensus because why should I take a Deontay Johnson as the fifth best wide receiver, which is where I have him valued this year as his upside? Why should I take him when I can probably get him in the fourth or fifth round? Why not take somebody who I might have ranked a little bit farther below him, but is going to be gone in the next round? So you have to take the consensus, which is an average draft position, into account, but you don't have to live and die by it. But
Yeah.
if you play the consensus wisely, you can get two players for the cost of one at your draft pick because I can take the guy that I know is going to be gone, and then I could take the higher rated guy on my cheat
Right.
sheet a round or two later. And
Yeah.
if you continue to get those 2-for-1 values in your draft, you'll have a better team.
Yeah, it definitely, the consensus definitely gives you an idea of what other people are thinking, of what the consensus is thinking. And so, okay, I can take the guy that I really like here, and the one that everyone else is really high on, but I'm not so high on, I can maybe take him a little later. Exactly. And just real
Yeah.
quick, and before I pass back off to Sean, it's funny, like the scenario you brought up before, where there's a player who gives you 20 points one week, 1 point another week. Whenever I hear that, whenever I think of that, players like that drive me crazy, and I try to stay away from them unless it's like my wide receiver 4 or something like that. The first player that comes into mind for me is Doug Baldwin, a wide receiver out of Seattle who was,
Yes.
the guy would blow up like 40 points one week, and everyone's like, Doug Baldwin, Doug Baldwin. And you wouldn't hear from the guy. He wouldn't, he probably like not do anything for the next 2 weeks, go on the IR for 2 weeks, come back, not do anything, then have another 40 point week, and that was, and I even remember advising a friend, the following year, who I had just gotten into fantasy. He was a newbie, but I was trying to help him out as much as I could. And he's like, "Oh, I'm thinking about taking Doug Baldwin this round." I said, "Listen," and it was early on. I think it was like it might have been like it might have been first round. Like he was like really rated high, and I was it might maybe second round, but I was like, "Hey man, I'm just saying my opinion. Stay away from the guy. He's got like this nice average amount of points, but it's all." I said he shows up every like once a month, and I said I'd stay away. At the end of the season, my friend Scott came up to me and said, "You're right about Doug Baldwin."
And that's why I developed a second statistical tool to go with the first one that is a consistency rating. And people say, oh, players aren't consistent in fantasy football. One week they score 2 touchdowns, the next week. Yes, they're inconsistent, but you can measure them against a set number. And if you look at how consistent a player is with posting 10 points, okay, a wide receiver, a running back, or tight end, how often does he score 10 points in PPR? Now, if he's my first running back that I took, if I took Jonathan Taylor with the first pick and all he's given me is 10 points, I'm not going to be very happy if that's all I get week in, week out. But I will be okay with that if 10 points is a bad week for that player. So when I grade players against a 10-point floor, how often did they give me a 10-point floor? If they give that to me more than 70% of the time, I'm playing that player every single week. And it's funny you mentioned Doug Baldwin because they've got a player out in Seattle that does the same thing right now, and it's not
Tyler
quite
Lockett.
as extreme, but Tyler Lockett. He consistently scores great in my weekly value tool, but he's under 60% when it comes to consistency. Now, I studied all of the logs from their games last year, and I discovered that one of the weird things is Tyler Lockett seems to pick up a lot of pass interference penalties more so than other wide receivers. So a lot of his missing points are because it was flagged on the play. They got a big gain, but you don't get credit for those points in fantasy football. So that brings Tyler Lockett's consistency down. But if you look at the two values, you've got a pretty good idea. If I'm drafting guys that always have a high weekly value on my chart, and they also have that consistency over 70%, that's a guy I'm going to rock and roll with all year long.
Oh yeah.
So the question that I think with a lot of us that do projections, the thing that sort of rattles the brain occasionally is, so we've been doing projections, and I generally do projections every year, but we've been doing projections as a company for Tulsa Titles. And I have 2 or 3 guys that are just way outside of what the consensus would be. Because generally I'll track sort of, it's out there. You can track sort of what the consensus projection are, what the consensus rating is, that sort of thing. Do fluctuations between your ratings and the ratings of the overall consensus actually bother you? Is it something that you take in? Do you do a little bit more analytical research, or generally do you understand that it's exactly what you're talking about? The projection doesn't necessarily mean how effective a player is.
No, that's exactly it. There's a lot of ways to get to those yardage goals that you're looking for, and here's how I got there, Sean. It was actually kind of by accident, because I was starting to do projections more than 30 years ago. Okay, and I was doing them for many years, and by the last year of doing projections, I was getting pretty doggone good at it, but I was noticing that my fantasy football results were not improving at the same level as my projection skill was. And that's when the light bulb moment hit that there's got to be some other way to figure this out other than projections. But yeah, if I was doing projections, if I was trying to come up with a number of how many yards Patrick Mahomes is going to throw for this year, and I was 15% more than consensus, because most people, when they're doing their projections for quarterbacks and other positions, they base that on if they're going to be healthy for a whole season. Now, I tended to do my projections for missing one game, because guys typically missed one game during a season. And for running backs, I always took 2 games off for running backs when I was doing my projections. So even when I did projections, I was thinking on a per game basis. And again, another light bulb moment. If you're doing that, why not just forecast the weekly value instead of forecasting a projection? Because players can spike. They can have a huge number of touchdowns one year. Cooper Kupp, again, he was my number 4 wide receiver last year. I had him ranked 4th through 10th was my range of outcomes for him. And I was wrong. He was number 1. But who cares? I was better than consensus, so he ended up on 80% of my teams. So therefore, I ended up with quite a few wins based on having Cooper Kupp. But I would have never projected that many points for Cooper Kupp. But the interesting thing is his weekly value really didn't raise up that much more than what you'd think. Now, when I say that, I also have to use the little qualifier that I do 2-year data samples for weekly values. So my weekly values to start the season are based on the 2020 and the 2021 season. I do that because 16 or 17 games now is not enough data points to really have a good feel for the quality of a player. And I don't care if I'm the best at projecting how many touchdowns Mahomes is going to have. I want to project how many big games is he likely to have compared to the other quarterbacks. And if I do that well, it doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong on what I think his total yardage and his touchdowns will be. I will win in the bankroll, which is where I want to win when it comes to fantasy football. And this is my 6th year of projecting my weekly values, doing a forecast of weekly values. I take last year's number, I add plus or minuses for the player if he's getting older, or if it's a young player, because young players get better with age to a certain point. Did the coach get better? Did the offense get better? Did the quarterback get better? Did the defense change completely? For a quarterback, if all of a sudden their defense is getting a lot better, that quarterback might be down in fantasy points this year because he doesn't need to be throwing at the end of a game so much. So I look at all of those factors, and I also then I kind of come up: is there a volume change? Is this player suddenly going from second string to first string? Is the second string guy gone and they're going to lean on him more? I look at all the factors and come up with a forecast of what the change in weekly value will be. Now, the good thing is, even if I suck at forecasting the change of the weekly value, most weekly values for players end up within 10% plus or minus from one year to the next, because players tend to hit a value and they hold that value. Their particular year might fluctuate. So in year end points, they might be RB1 one year, RB5 the next, RB3, RB7, RB10. But in weekly value, they're always the third best choice over the course of that 3 or 4 year period. And that's what I'm looking for. I don't care if I pick out who is going to be the RB1. I care who is more likely to be a valuable player week in, week out on my fantasy football team with the least amount of uncertainty. And, a lot of times this is a rare year, because usually in weekly value, I do not end up forecasting the same RB to be number 1. This year, Jonathan Taylor was so good last year, and he's a young player who should even get better, which is scary. I just kind of wish he was on the Chiefs. But he's likely to get better, but he might have the volume drop a little this year. So do those two things kind of cancel each other out? But this is one of those rare years where I'm going back to back with the same RB1. I am not picking Cooper Cup, though, to be my WR1 this year. I've actually got two guys ahead of him.
So, with your particular process, how do you factor in rookies? Because the
Ooh,
college game is so much different than the pro game, and it's a lot of times given the offenses and the way the defenses play, and particularly on conference. Like if you play in the Big 12, wide open offenses, defense is not as big of a priority. To an NFL game where everyone's faster, you're running different offenses and defenses. How do you take that particular model and project a guy like Brees Hall or Travis Etienne? Because we've seen in previous years guys like Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson start this like mountain climb where by the end of the year they're a top 12 weekly wide receiver, but beginning of the year they really aren't.
yeah, and the trust for a running back is earned, it's not given. And, we see that every year because, a great example was that kid out of Baltimore or that came in when all the other guys went down with injuries. That Tyson Williams, he had a great first week. And then all of a sudden he missed the linebacker on the blitz, and Lamar Jackson was, had didn't even have enough time to write his will, his last will and testament before being planted in the turf, and all of a sudden we didn't see any more Tasson anymore. And that happens quite often with rookie running backs. They have to earn their playing time, especially in the passing game, because the quarterback's the most valuable player in the team. You don't want to get him killed. And a lot of times they don't understand these blitz packages because they're so different in the NFL than they are even at the elite levels of college football. So that is tough. But remember, I'm forecasting who's going to be best over a 10 game stretch, not a 17 game stretch. So I got some room for error there. But how I do it is best illustrated by Brees Hall because he's another one of the players that I really like this year. I'm surprised his ADP is not rising any more than it has because Michael Carter was not exactly well loved in the passing game last year. They were using just about every old veteran that they could find to try to plug him in and take some of those passing down, uh, yardage downs away from Michael Carter. But the rookies are tough to handicap because, you know, one play in preseason and you hear the analysts getting ready to get the gold jacket ready for him and start carving the bust for Canton. Whereas, the reality, I mean, look how many times we hear bad reports about rookies and they end up being great, like Jamar Chase last year, Traylon Burks
Yeah.
this year. I guess he can't breathe. And then you got Velus Jones with the Bears, who apparently, I guess, according to some of the analysts, he's already eligible for AARP before he's played his first down. So I don't look at a lot of what the analysts and the beat writers are saying because, first of all, did you ever see a beat writer article that get really popular in the social media world when all it says is another great practice by the Bears today? There's always somebody that they're going to be ripping. So I don't take any of that coach talk or any of the camp
Mm,
talk into consideration. But here's how I forecast a rookie. I know what the player who was in that position, I know what his weekly value was last year. So the question is, do I think the rookie's going to get enough volume to be better, worse, or about the same as the guy that held that position last year? In the case of Brees Hall, I think he's going to be about 10% better than Michael Carter, and Michael Carter was not bad when he was on the field. So
yeah.
if I'm right about my Brees Hall forecast, he's a solid value where he's going in drafts right now. But rookies are very dangerous players to go for. And usually I will not draft a rookie really early in redraft because of that. I'll take the cagey veteran who I know is going to do well versus the rookie who may or may not get into the game very well. Jamar Chase was the only example that I've had in recent years of a rookie that I was drafting a lot of in fantasy football redraft last year. The guy was a stud, and I loved all the camp talk about him not being able to see the ball because it didn't have a stripe on it. I loved all that talk because it just made his ADP juicier and juicier as until the first games were played, and then everybody saw how much of a study it was really going to be. But rookies are tough to forecast. There's no doubt about it. And again, you're just trying to be better than what the consensus is about that player. I will miss on a lot of rookies because I have them forecast lower than where they're going in the ADP as that shiny new object. But every once in a while, I have an exception to that rule.
Yeah, with Brees Hall, I mean, I like him as a player a lot. I may not be as high on him right now as others, but I do like his situation compared to Michael Carter last year as a rookie. He's coming into you would assume a better offense. The stud wide receiver, potential stud wide receiver that got in the first round, that bumps Elijah Moore down to being like a number two, which ideally he should be. And you got Zach Wilson entering his second year in the same offense. So there's room for growth all around. I just look at it holistically that way. So me myself, I do like Brees Hall a lot, and I'm not sure exactly where the ADP is on him, but I do have my eye on him. But I got to continue my mind to gauge, really how much I really like him a lot. And real quick question, Sean, before I just pass the baton back to you, just because I want to just get on get on this before we move forward. Dennis, you had touched on defense before, and it's something that always intrigues me in terms of how an improved defense can impact a fantasy quarterback. I always kind of like automatically approach it like when I see a team getting a better defense, that I almost like the quarterback more because I feel like he's going to get the ball back more. And yes, like he may, if the defense isn't so good, you're going to get into a shootout, which is good for quarterback fantasy stats, obviously, and other offensive stats. But I also see it as him getting the ball back more. Is there anything that do you see it that way? Like, does that measure in at all, or and it just depends on the situation?
Yeah, yeah, it can. It really can. Because there's the difference between junk time yards and a team that is going to be mainly a passing team. With the Chiefs, I look at them in fewer shootouts, so that might take the top end off of Mahomes a little bit. I actually think this Chiefs defense has a chance of being much better than the last couple of years, and they weren't bad
I agree.
the last couple of years. But if you look at when Mahomes was the all consensus, all things QB1 could walk on water fantasy football quarterback, that was happening when the Chiefs defense was woeful and they were getting into these, games in the 40s type of thing. But you're right, Joe. The defense, it's a complicated issue because you can't have such a bad defense that you don't get the ball back.
Mhm.
But it's one of the reasons why I really do prefer running backs on good teams. By
Yeah,
saying that, I mean good offensive teams because I want my teams to score more. And if you've got a better offense, those are the running backs that I want to surround myself with. Unfortunately, a lot of times those are also the teams that are using running back by committee. So it's kind of there's no one size fits all in fantasy football, but it is a case where I do think the defense, you have to look at it. It's if you're going to get into shootouts, that's the second quarterback I want in my super flex. Okay, I want a guy who's going to get a lot of junk time yards. Same with wide receivers. I want junk time yard wide receivers. But you're right, Joe. It's a lot more complicated because if the defense is really, really crappy, then you don't get the ball back and the game gets shortened up. And that is a
yeah,
big, big problem,
yeah.
especially if the
Running back
defense
is
is
out of the
really,
equation.
yeah, if the defense is really bad against the run, that's when I start worrying about everybody on that team. I don't want them to be so woeful against the run. Because that's how teams shorten the game down and take fantasy points away from your guy. But yeah, you're right. It is pretty complicated when it comes to defenses.
So, what is your year-end process? So you said that you don't necessarily look at year-end stats, but like all of us, at the end of the year, you say you're right on 60% of the players or 70% of the players. You're right 65. You said anything over 50 is good. So, right 60% of the time. What is your process as far as strengthening your own system? So you have your own evaluation system, which is different than the majority of people. So it does give you the advantage there. What is the process that you use to sort of go back, look through, see if there's anything wrong, and how much of the changing of the NFL changes your process? So
Oh,
specifically, last year, the Bills and the Chiefs sort of got stuck in this too high safety where they were having to dink and dunk, and you saw the progression of Devin Singletary because they were giving so much of the field away. How much of that goes into your overall evaluation system and your evaluation of players? Because the thing that I put to being sort of the big change in the NFL was when Peyton Manning started seeing 3-4 defenses, because it was something that he had never seen before. He had a team that had two speed rushers, but he had never seen a defense that had been all spread out. You had the Ravens and other teams, and that changed a lot of people's valuations the next year of Peyton Manning. How do those two particular things, how does your year-end process change on a year-to-year basis, and what is that actual process? And then how much do you look in the changes of the game overall as far as how you look at the particular player?
that is another great question because one of the things that I'm really big on is what I call how many snaps equals a full game for an offense. And it used to be with running backs, I would want, but well, first of all, a game used to be about 65 plays, okay, on average, 65 offensive plays. So I wanted my running back to be on the field for at least more than half of those. So I wanted at least 30 snaps before I counted that as a full game played, a full offensive game played. Now it's down to 20. If I got a running back that gets 20 offensive snaps, he has played a full game. And that's one of the big changes. You can you can chase that difference in either touches or opportunities or in snaps. Um, Thankfully, we got some great free websites out there that give us offensive snap data now. And even on Sleeper, which I play a lot of, you get a percentage, you get snap count percentages of how many offensive plays that they did play. And by looking at that data, you can see how things change. The last time I did a study about running backs, for instance, I did a study pre COVID. I haven't done a study since COVID because COVID added so many more missing players to the equation. So I'm sure it went up. But from 2016 to 2019, I charted how many offensive or how many running backs get 15 or more touches of the ball in the season for a particular team. The average was 3.2 different players got 15 or more touches in at least one game during the season. That just shows you how chaotic it is at running back right now. And that led to a change of my strategy. And, I have the benefit of working with a guy, Professor John Bush, who I can give him any set of data and he can turn it upside down with all these statistical tools and save me a lot of time. But he's better at the stats than at analyzing the data than I am. And so when I give him a set of data or give him an idea, he just runs with it. And the man is a genius, by the way. But he's a biology PhD. He's a biology professor down in Arkansas. So the guy had to be pretty smart. But
I
when
was
it
going to
comes
say
to
he better be a genius.
now he will say that PhD just means piled higher and deeper, but that's all another story. But he is a genius and he's really good at analyzing the data. And we stumbled across something this year that we're beta testing. So here's the thing, Sean, you're right. You never can be complacent because the game's always changing. You mentioned the two deep thing that killed Mahomes. He had five of his worst fantasy football games in his career all last season before they learned that they could not continue to try to beat those defenses deep. Then they just bled him to death. Little dinks and dunks, and that was great. But you're right. The teams will react to the defenses. So I don't try to predict how the teams are going to react to how they're being defensed. I'm figuring that the coaches will be smart enough. I just look at the points. I just look at the fantasy points. And if the guy gets me the fantasy points, I'm happy. But the big way that the game is changing is looking at what a full game is. How many running backs are used? These sorts of things are the things that we're researching. But we stumbled across a piece of data that I think is going to be a big game changer. The professor's doing all kinds of work on it, and will continue to beta test this all year. But it's games over median. If you look at how many games a player has, how many of his fantasy football point games are higher than the median at that position, and you look at that data in the right way, which I think is median for the year, not just week 5, was he better than the median? I look at, was he better than the median all year long? How many games did he do that? And I think that will be the next step into understanding consistency in fantasy football, because one of the quarterbacks that is not always well loved in the fantasy football circles was the top guy in games over median last year. And it'll make sense once I tell you who it was. Any guesses who
Is
it
it
might have been,
Carr?
first of all?
Is it Carr?
No.
Ryan Tannehill.
No, it's not that crazy, but it was Jalen Hurts, and
Hmm.
it's the rushing yards
Yeah,
that prop up
makes sense.
his underbelly of production. But he had more games above median than anybody else last year, and he had a great streak of those games at the end of the year. His second half was better than his first half in games over median. Coincidentally, his second half was also better if you look at his weekly value using my tools. So, but you're right, Sean. You always have to be kind of chasing the next thing because football is always changing. The other thing that I'm looking at is my theory, my hypothesis. And in science, you come up with a hypothesis and then you try to find the statistical studies that either prove it or prove that it's false or prove that it's right. This is unlike the typical way that a fantasy football player uses statistics, which is closer to how a drunk uses a light pole. In fantasy football, we see guys fall in love with a player. I love Gabriel Davis. He had a 4 touchdown game in the playoffs, and now he's going to be getting to start more often and play more often, and he's going to be the wonder kid of fantasy football. And there's a part of me that thinks that is correct, that he will be much better than he's been in the past. But we will look at that, and we'll look at a player like Aron Ra St. Brown, who I just call ARSB, over in Detroit. And we look at ARSB and that same player, that same person that says, Gabriel Davis, look at these best 5 games that he's had over the last 2 years. He is going to be a stud when he's starting full time. They will look at the stats that ARSB had in the second half of the season. They'll say, it's just a fluke because everybody else was out. And he got the targets because nobody else was there to catch the ball. And now they've added a couple of wide receivers. He's not going to be a thing. Well, how can you be on Gabriel Davis, who incidentally only got those chances at the end of the season because Emmanuel Sanders was all gimpy? And how can you be for him because he had the targets and he had the success, although less success than ARSB had? And then beyond, off the ARSB train, if you're going to have a process that says, I will take a short period of production and I will make that the full year of production if the guy is starting next year, you'd have to be on both players. But the hypocrite, the two-faced fantasy football analyst in all of us, and I'm guilty of this just like everybody else, we will cherry pick which stat we like and use that to prop the player up, and we'll cherry pick the bad stat to prove why the other guy isn't going to be good. Whereas if you have a process like I have developed with my weekly value, you have a number. The math don't lie. And it's just a matter of following that process and being correct on the forecast of how that process is going to change to determine how that player will be in the coming year. But if you're not constantly looking at the way the game is being played different, because my hypothesis when it comes to wide receivers is that we will see less of a productive second receiver on teams for fantasy football because the second, third, and fourth wide receivers will be splitting the targets. You'll still have the alpha who will be a strong guy in fantasy football because he's going to get fed. You know, your Devontae Adamses of the world and all those, they're going to get fed. Stephon Diggs is another example. He's going to get fed the ball. But I think we're going to have less of the Higgins sort of thing where he is a viable fantasy football starter every week, even though Jamar Chase is the clear number one on that team. Higgins is going to get enough volume to be also a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy football. But that might be the exception to the rule. We might see more teams because of the defenses that are being played where their second, third, and fourth wide receivers split the target share to the point where you only have one viable fantasy football wide receiver on each team for redraft. Best ball is a whole nother story.
It's interesting that people talk about Gabriel Davis and I just call him Sun God, but Amon-Ra St. Brown. I did a lot of studying into Gabe Davis because I was curious, and the person whose stats I can sort of draw a correlation to between Gabe Davis is Mike Williams. It's a similar situation where he was the second wide receiver on a very productive offense, but he was used in a very particular way that, it draws out the year-end stats. Mike Williams is always the deep threat for that offense. People will point to, well, Gabe Davis will become Mike Williams, but Mike Williams was actually more productive last year when his ADOT went down. The vast majority of the games that he had early in the year what made everyone go wild, and then he had this long dip where he didn't really produce anything, is you have to look at the stats and try to draw a picture of what is actually going on. Gabe Davis had the role that Emmanuel Sanders replaced him in his rookie year, and then they found someone to replace him. So the Bills aren't necessarily in love with Gabe Davis, the fact that they found someone to replace him. But what you're talking about does bring me to my next question, which is vacated targets, which you see everywhere along Twitter and your fantasy football spaces of Allen Lazard's going to be a top 24 wide receiver because of vacated targets. My theory is that in a situation like that, the targets actually spread out. That in Kansas City or in Green Bay, if there isn't that sort of dominant wide receiver, because Kelsey is a tight end, you sort of see a spread as opposed to someone taking that role. What is your process for figuring that out, and do you agree?
Yeah, vacated targets is the worst excuse made for making somebody a king in fantasy football. I have seen so many people this year who have said, with Devontae Adams gone, we are going to see Aaron Jones go up so much in targets that he's going to be the guy to own. And I look at that same data and I say, AJ Dillon, who didn't get a whole lot of work early in the season last year and got almost no work as a rookie, he had almost as many receiving yards as Aaron Jones with far few targets. What if A.J. Dillon's the better running back? What if A.J. Dillon is the guy that picks up some targets this year? What if is all you can do when it comes to vacated targets? Once again, the professor, John Bush, did a study on targets and where do these targets go? And what we discovered is without any changes on a team, without any personnel changes that would make you guess that vacated targets were a thing, we saw big fluctuations between the running back, the wide receiver, and the tight end share with no changes in personnel. So using that theory or using that data and applying it to vacated targets, it makes you wonder, where will those go? Can we get any answer? Well, the theory is fine to say they're going to go one direction if you want to use that to argue your case for a particular player. But when the data says that targets fluctuate in a crazy way from one year to the next, and I'm not talking about like Devontae Adams, his target share has been pretty solid from one year to the next. It doesn't vary by more than a few percent. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the other percentage, the percentage of how many passes went to running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. And if you look at that number on a given year for a given team, the numbers go crazy. And sometimes it makes sense with Atlanta last year losing Calvin Ridley, and not having really a chance to replace him. The targets, the vacated targets of Calvin Ridley did not go to Gage or, anybody else on the wide receiver group. They all went to Pitts and CPAT, because CPAT was this
Mhm.
hybrid player that, was getting a lot of short passes. And so there it made sense. But with other examples that we looked at in great detail, they didn't make sense. So if you want to make an assumption on vacated targets and that they're all going to go to Lazard, maybe, maybe Lazard picks up a ton. Maybe Lazard's a better player than we give credit for. He's been dinked up a lot in the over the years, where he hasn't been 100% when he's been playing. He's been on the injury list earlier in the week, and then he's played. So, was he healthy? Can he stay healthy? Is he a alpha wide receiver? I mean, when we saw players leave Green Bay in the past, Jordy Nelson, for instance, he left. They didn't all of a sudden send all the targets the way of the running back or the tight end. They all went to another wide receiver. So, or they got split by wide receivers. But I think you're right, Sean. I think again, it plays into how defenses are going to try to defense a team that will determine where those targets go as well. Look at Kansas City last year when they took Tyreek Hill out of the game. Kelsey was still getting his targets. They don't seem to like to throw to the running backs that at a great amount. They haven't over the number of years here. Whether it's the lack of talent or just Mahomes is looking a little deeper down the field, who knows? But what we saw was every week, either Demarcus Robinson or Pringle would pop up with a higher target share on one particular week. And then it would quickly go away the next week, and somebody else would be the magic guy to get more targets that week. So it's a case where the defense might dictate. Does Juju Smith-Schuster, who has been able to be a bit of a, pardon the phrase, target whore in the past, does he get back into that role, or do we see Hardman and Juju and Sky Moore and anybody else out there? Maybe Josh Gordon's still alive. Do we see all these guys split it? Do we see them play more two tight end sets? And do we see, Bell get into the game? Do we see, Noah Gray get into the game? I mean, there's ways that could go. All of a sudden, does, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, a full year recovered from a gallbladder surgery, does he all of a sudden learn how to play football? This is his first off season he's had healthy. So does that mean anything? Um, all of these things are unknowns, but vacated targets, the simple answer, they're never as simple as you think you want them to be, but they make a great excuse if you want to prop up one player.
Yeah,
So
I've got my eye on Sky Moore
I
big
like
time.
Sky. I think
I,
he
I
could
love the
be a heck of a
situation.
player. I think he could be a
Yeah,
heck of a player, and I
yeah,
just don't know whether how quickly he's going to adjust. It does look a little
right.
weird seeing a number 24 on a wide receiver, though. Are,
Yeah,
are
it's
they
he's rookie,
are they
so it's all.
Are they trying to tell us that he's going to line up in the backfield like Tyreek did and get the jet sweep action, which is a
Mm,
valuable piece of offense in the Kansas City Chiefs attack?
yeah.
He might be a better candidate for that than Mecole Hardman.
Maybe they got some cheetah two going on there. We'll see. But I've got my eye on it big time.
Yep. And Joe, there comes another strategy that I point out for the younger players, or the newer players, is late in a draft. Once I get past about the eighth or ninth or 10th round in a typical draft that goes 16 rounds, man, I roll the dice. I grab a Sky Moore, I grab a Christian Watson, I grab any
Same.
wide receiver who's got a chance of breaking through. The worst case scenario, I already have my four wide receivers that I can count on. Okay? I already grabbed three or four guys with different bye weeks, and I don't have to change. And so
Yep.
I'm only looking for a flex play anyway. So
Hmm.
why take an ordinary wide receiver as my fifth guy or as my
Hmm.
fourth guy if I only got three at that point? I'm taking every rookie that is not tied down, that has not been
Yeah.
taken yet. I am taking them, and I'm taking a Velas Jones and gambling in Chicago. I'm taking a Sky Moore. I'm taking a Christian Watson. If they are not taken yet, I'll take a Kyle Phillips in the last round from
Hmm.
Tennessee. I will take guys that they're either going to be all or nothing. And if they're
Yeah.
nothing, guess what? They're off the team, and I'll grab another running back week 3 or 4. But
Yeah.
speculate on big upside players late
Yep.
in your drafts.
Yeah. And those sweet situations where they're playing with a great quarterback and wide receiver situation's not settled. They don't have that true alpha. I'm with you. Like I'm not into like boring, mundane, wide receivers with, you know, low, kind of like low floors. And yeah, they can give you like 10 points one week, but really that's their ceiling. And it's just too many of those. They're a dime a dozen. You can pick them up for any week.
Now that's exactly the plays. You want the big upside guys, and a lot of the rookies are sliding on down to that eighth round and later, and those are the kind of
Yeah.
guys that I'm going to be all over this year, because they do give you so much upside potential. I mean, Drake London going in the 10th round as the 48th wide receiver taken. Who else is in Atlanta? Brian Edwards? Come on. You
Yeah.
gotta you gotta
I,
take a chance on that guy at that round.
yeah. And the ball's got to go to someone besides Pitts.
Yep.
The one thing that I will say is when we talk about ADP within our space is that especially for the newer listener, the newer viewer, the person in your home league, expect wild fluctuations in what that ADP is. So in our space, there's actually more of a true ADP because consensus is once you get to a certain level, the people that you're playing with are literally the people making the rankings. So I mean, you can for a
Correct.
most part judge where people are going to go. But a lot of people ask me questions, and my general answer is pick a range and then know the league that you're in. So I'm originally from Jacksonville. If I was playing in a league from Jacksonville, I'm probably going to have to overdraft Travis Etienne, maybe Christian Kirk, but know your league, specifically when we talk about ADP, and know the knowledge base of the people in your league. So if they don't watch college football, they might not know who Drake London is, and you may be able to grab him a few rounds later. But the question is, how would you advise somebody to see the whole picture as far as analytics is concerned? Because as you talked about before, a lot of people on Twitter and other spaces are using parts of the data here and there to prove their point. But for me, it's a little disingenuous because they're not necessarily looking at the entire picture. They have their point or their hot take or whatever it is, whatever trends or ratios on Twitter, and they're trying to mold a point around it. If you're a new player and you don't necessarily haven't been playing for 10 or 20 years and you can look around it, what are the things that you would look at to sort of prove their hypothesis or deny it? What is the best way that you have to look at the entire picture?
Yeah, I like to look at ADPs that are built on a consensus of more than one website, because your websites, a lot of your more casual fans are playing still at ESPN or Yahoo. The difference between Yahoo and ESPN is tremendous. Over at scienceoffantasyfootball.com, we're looking at FPPC leagues, and we're specifically looking at those because they were all money leagues. So these were people paying money and sometimes big money to play a lot more money than I'd gamble on fantasy football, and I think I know what I'm doing. I wouldn't pay $1,000 to join a league, but you got people over there at FPPC that are doing that, and other websites that are hosting these games that are doing that. But I look at something more general. I look at one of my favorite sites for ADP data is Fantasy Football Calculator because they'll look at a lot of different sites and they seem to update it. But here's the thing that you got to look at when it comes to ADP. Don't just look at the core number. Look at the variance of what that player did. And that variance increases considerably as you go farther in a draft. And I just mentioned Drake London. I'll look at his data. He's going as early as late fourth round in some drafts, and he's going as late as the 13th. So he's going as early as 409, and he's going as late as 1306. So he gets a consensus of 1009 is the average in his drafts, and it'll also show you how many times he got drafted in a particular league. And you can see certain guys have a lower ADP, but down there in the 10th to 12th rounds, but they weren't drafted in as many leagues. So it's interesting to see you get some of these guys that are the ultimate sleepers. They'll go to late in your round. But when it comes to a more casual, more average fan who's going to be drafted over at NFL.com's fantasy site or ESPN, use the ADP from those sites because that's the majority. If you're playing against like players who are also somewhat casual players, they'll be going by that ADP right from that site. But in your hip pocket, if you want to beat them, have that data from a consensus site and know what the ranges are so you know going in, hey, if I take Matthew Stafford as my quarterback, I can get him as early as, I got to draft him in some leagues by the 7th round. Maybe I can wait till the 12th in some rounds or some drafts. You'll get an idea of the range of where that player is going on a consensus of sites, and that'll let you know when you see his name pop up on your screen if he's a value or not.
How about do you have any of your own? Who are some of your favorite? Who are some of your favorite players in fantasy football this year?
Well, it's funny you might mention that because I got one guy. You ever have that one guy that you're
Oh yeah,
always negative about? You're always
yep.
negative about, and
But I
usually
also
you're
have the
right about
opposite
him.
too.
Yeah, exactly. So you get these players you love or hate, and that's what I tried to eliminate with my weekly values because it's all math. It's taking, and I even do these in the blind. So I look at a player and I say, okay, how is his volume changing? How is, all these situations. I look at it honestly and I come up with a percentage change. Then I apply it to his number. I haven't even really looked at his number in a month or two, so I don't know what he ended the season at. So I don't know what my increase will do as far as his overall ranking position. Joe Mixon is a guy that I've had a love hate relationship with since he came in the league in fantasy football. And this year it's love. I've got him as one of my guys that I'm really high on. But when I look at value of a player, I look at it, am I higher or lower on this guy than ADP? So my value list looks a little bit different because obviously with the first pick in the draft, I'm not taking Joe Mixon or Dalvin Cook or Alvin Kamara, but those are my value guys. Those are my guys that are falling for a particular reason. I love Mixon this year. I don't see any reasoning other than injury of why he would
Yeah,
be worse than last year. And I look at that Cincinnati offense to be really stout, and I still think they want to run the game late or run the ball late in the game.
yeah,
I love Dalvin Cook because he's going to finally be with an offensive coordinator and a head coach that actually know how to use offensive players. So I'm really big on him. I don't care that he misses 3 or 4 games a year on a regular basis. I want him out there for the 10 to 14 games
yeah.
that he'll be
He's too
healthy.
good.
I'll patch and fill around him when that's coming, because when he's out, I don't take a zero. I just play somebody else. And with my, I'll be releasing an article this week that's called "Better Than Zero," better than the zero RB method. That'll be coming out on Science and Fantasy Football, and I'll give you a hint. It has to do with having more than zero running backs. It has to do with having a boatload of them. But I'm not as afraid of taking an Alvin Kamara right now as well. Alvin Kamara is a top five running. He's a top five pick in the first round based on his talent. It's that uncertainty about a suspension that
Yeah.
has people freaked out and is dropping him into the second or even third round on some occasions in
Where do
one
you have
quarterback
Kamara right
leagues.
now? Where do you have
I've got
Kamara right now?
so Kamara on my
Given his
rankings.
situation, the uncertainty with the situation.
Yeah, so I looked at his situation and I said, okay, I'm going to forecast as if he's possibly going to miss a few games and
Yeah.
it might impact him or whatever. And so I dropped him down to RB9. He's my ninth best running back. But if I'm wrong on my forecast, okay, if I'm off on my forecast, and I add 10 more percent to his total, he comes up to RB5 for me instantly. So
Mm.
if he's available in the
Yeah.
second round, I'm going to grab him because guess what?
Yeah.
His legal things have been delayed 2 months. They're probably going to be delayed another few months. Next thing you know, we're not worrying about this until next year. And the
Yeah.
uncertainty over suspension is already baked in. And I think the worst he's going to get is 4 games. So even if he would happen to get that, maybe it happens at the playoff time, but hey, maybe he gets injured at playoff time too. So I don't care about those. I also like Elijah Mitchell, and talk about a love-hate relationship. I've had a hate relationship with San Francisco and New England backfields, but I will take
Mm.
Elijah Mitchell at his current price. And my other guy might shock you because he is going so blasted cheap, and he had a great end of the season last year. Yes, the offense is going to be worse without Russell Wilson, but Rashad Penny is a free square right now.
Mm.
If he can stay healthy, you grab him. And in
Mm.
drafts, in redraft, you can get Rashad Penny and Ken Walker and have them both
Yeah.
and be
Yep.
safe. But those are the guys I like at running back. Wide receiver, this is the year where the fourth through sixth rounds at wide receiver is where you can absolutely load up on the position. I'll take a guy early in the draft like a Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase and have my anchor wide receiver. Then I'll fill out the rest of my wide receivers in the fourth through sixth round. I'll grab guys like Deontay Johnson, Brandon Cooks, Terry McLaurin. The Sun God will be there. Um,
Yeah.
Juju Smith-Schuster is going so late in drafts. He's way cheaper than he should be right now. Allen Robinson is going to be. Remember
Hmm.
last year when people were drafting Bobby Trees right about at the same time the Cooper Cup was going?
Yeah.
Allen
Yeah.
Robinson's a better player when healthy than
Right.
Robert Woods, but Elijah Moore and Robert Woods are two guys I like as well,
Yeah.
because they're all going to be there. And then after that, at wide receiver, I'm taking the rookies that fall past the seventh, eighth round, and I'll load up on the rookies to end that. My tight ends might shock you too, because obviously Kelsey and Andrews are going to be 1 and 1A any way you line them up. Even though Kelsey's getting a little old in the tooth, he'll still be
Yeah.
reliable in that offense. George Kittle is falling way too far in drafts. And the other guy that if I miss out on the elite guys, I'm taking TJ Hawkinson. I think
Mm.
TJ Hawkinson's upside this year is nothing but just pure gold. I think how often do you see people jump on a bandwagon with a tight end and then the guy is good but not great, and they hop off that bandwagon, and then he
Yeah.
becomes elite? That's where I think Hawkinson's potential is this year.
Yeah.
And I miss out on all those guys. Pat Freiermuth is my long shot tight end with upside. I also like guys like Goddard and Schultz, but you got to overpay for
Yeah.
them. Freiermuth is like a free square right now. He's going so late in drafts,
He's
and he had some good games with a
yeah.
quarterback that didn't have an arm left last year. And anybody. Trubisky is better. Joe, I think you got better arm than Big Ben had last year. You might have been
You
a
know
better
what?
choice.
I felt bad for Fryermuth. Well, not bad, but I knew he was going to like a not a great QB situation. But I loved him when he was drafted, and there were two teams who I thought were perfect for him. One was Baltimore because they're like tight end NFL team number one. They love their tight ends and they use them. And number two, I thought when he was drafted in Pittsburgh, I'm like, you know what, that's a great situation for him because I do think they will make use of him, and he's going to be, given like you know, I think the situation is perfect for him to really take a big jump forward this year for
And they
Ironman.
got
So
and
I'm
they
a
got
believer in the guy.
and they got three wide receivers that can
Hmm.
spread the field out for you. And that means that there's going to be a soft spot over the middle for Freermuth
Yeah,
to eat all day long, and
yeah,
it's just a matter of the chemistry with the new quarterbacks. That's the
yeah.
only question that you have there. But again, I go back to the coach. The coach is pretty damn smart. If he's got a good
Yeah,
offensive tool, he's going to find him and he's going to use him.
I agree.
And a quarterback, my value guys might surprise you. Yeah, if I can get Josh Allen, I'm going to grab him all day long. He's the best value as far as the most likely to be the top quarterback when it comes to points. But you're never going to get Patrick Mahomes cheaper than he's coming
Hmm.
this year. And I think he's going to be better this year, even
Yeah,
without Tyreek. They've got
he's
better
Mahomes.
weapons. They got better weapons from second through fifth on that team than they had last year at wide receiver. And, I just think he's going to be much better. I also like Joe Burrow. I do not understand why he's sliding in redraft leagues.
Yeah,
That
he's
one
elite.
doesn't. Yeah, he's an
He's an
elite
elite. He's
guy,
an elite QB. He's not going
and
anywhere. He's
and I'm
top
not
five.
yeah, and I'm not believing the camp talk about Matthew Stafford. That there's nothing wrong with his elbow. He's gonna be just fine. He's an old man, for crying out loud. Of course, his elbow's gonna be sore when he first starts throwing. It reminds me of spring training for baseball teams every year, where every pitcher over 30 years old is having troubles with their elbow and trouble with their arm and trouble with their shoulder after that first spring training game, and most of them bounce back just fine. So I don't look for any problem with Stafford. And also in redraft, Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady are just being ignored by people.
Mhm.
I will grab them at value whenever they drop.
Yeah, those are two guys that always people have been, waiting for them to retire for years now, especially Brady. Brady for the past 10 years, and he always winds up having a fantastic season. I remember I got Brady. What was it? Super Bowl year. I think I got him like I don't know. Every other like notable quarterback was gone, and I was super happy to get him. First was his first year in Tampa Bay, I guess, and maybe second. I don't know, but he was phenomenal. I got him like in the I think like eighth round. It might have been later than that, and I was so happy. I'm like, this guy's playing with a stacked wide receiving core, and he's Tom Brady. He knows what he's doing.
Well, he's even older than Velas Jones, yet he had a 13% increase in his weekly value last year as a 44-year-old. So I think
Yeah,
you can kind of figure that Brady is going to be solid again this year.
yeah, always is.
So, from a roster construction standpoint, this is always an interesting question to ask people who have been doing this a really long time. First question I have is when in a one quarterback league, when would you start considering drafting a quarterback? And the second question is the handcuff debate that's been on Twitter for a number of months now. Do you draft your hero RB's handcuff, or do you draft another handcuff and try to double the points if a running back gets hurt? Because obviously, as you said, we can't predict injuries.
Yeah, here's the thing. There's very few quarterbacks that give you good consistency week in, week out. As we talked, Jalen Hurts had the most games above median of anybody else. The other two really strong guys over the last 2 years are Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen. So you've got a top heavy group at quarterback. If you don't look at points on a year end basis or a points per game basis, but you just look at who's the most consistent, your top quarterbacks are more consistent. So there is a time and a place sometimes where I will go very early on quarterback. And here's how I kind of learned that is I always go with how the draft is going at quarterback because I've made two mistakes. I was the guy who was like, one year I was playing against a bunch of really good players in a one quarterback redraft. It was a money league. It was all fantasy football analysts, and I didn't catch on early enough, and it was the eighth round, and not a single quarterback had been taken. And it came that aha moment. It's like the number one quarterback is the guy to own in this league because he's now become a value. And he's only become a value because everybody was on this I'm going to draft a quarterback late thing. So I grabbed, and it was Aaron Rodgers. I grabbed him in like the eighth round, one of his good years, and not his second set of good years, but way back when. And I was like, I grabbed the best quarterback in the middle of the eighth round. This is insane. But it just shows you that sometimes people just will go with the flow. And I've got a simple formula as I lay out a bunch of players that I really like at their value in the first three rounds. I'll rarely take a quarterback before the fourth round in a one quarterback redraft. Now, if it's a 14 team league or a 16 team league, that changes it all because position scarcity tells me go a little bit earlier on quarterback. But you can still wait in most cases. If I'm at the end of a swing, either way, I'm either at the very beginning or the very end of a draft, I'm a little bit more worried about the quarterback position because you can get caught on a run where you're 20 picks away and all of a sudden all the quarterbacks are gone that you wanted, and then you're like, oh, I'm stuck, and I got to play a streaming game. The other extreme that I got caught up with was in my home league, where I'm the most experienced fantasy football player. It's a bunch of fun people that I actually taught how to play fantasy football, and now they're kicking my ass. It's nothing more embarrassing, by the way. But the in that league, I forgot that this is a 12 team league, and everybody likes to take two quarterbacks. So, and they like to take two quarterbacks fairly early. So, if you don't take a guy by the seventh or eighth round, you're out of luck, even if you only wanted one. So, you have to know who you're going against. So that's a quarterback. So the easy answer on quarterback is I watch the draft. I'm usually not the first guy to grab a quarterback, but I'll grab Josh Allen if my targets in the first three rounds are all gone by the fourth round. I'm going to grab Josh Allen if he's still on the board. I might even grab him in the third round. I might grab Mahomes in the fifth. It all depends on how I feel that draft is coming about. But mainly it's just going by how quarterbacks are going off the board because I know I can get a good one. When it comes to running backs, I don't care whose handcuff it is. I'll handcuff my guy. If my player's on a good offense, I want not only his backup in deep league rosters, I want the backup to the backup. So, for instance, with Los Angeles now, I have got a team where I've got Cam Akers. I'm trying to get Henderson, and I've already got Kyron Williams on my team. I would love to have all three running backs for Los Angeles. If I'm
Right.
wrong about that being a good offense, then everybody's wrong about it being a good offense. But I don't care who the running backs are. Last year I had Sony Michelle and I had Cam Akers, or I had Sony Michelle and I had Henderson on some teams. So you go with what you can and make sure that you have that handcuff to a great player. But as far as this whole idea of, well, I'm going to handcuff my opponent's running back so that way when a guy gets hurt, I can have two running backs. Well, you can't figure out who's going to get hurt. So my
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
answer is I hoard running backs. So in a
I'm
typical
the same
six
way.
yeah, so in a typical 16 team or 16 player league where you draft 16 players and it's a 12 or a 10 team league, I'll have one quarterback for most often. I'll have one tight end. I'll have four wide receivers, and the rest of my roster will be running backs. So
Yeah.
I will heavy on running backs. And if the site allows me, I won't draft a kicker or a defense on draft day. I will grab two extra running backs, and then I will
Yeah.
decide who I'm going to play in there. But I will like to buy positions. So if I grabbed Singletary at value and Cook is still there, I'll grab Cook as well.
Yeah.
Now, if it's a deep roster dynasty league and I've already got Singletary, and like last year I had Singletary and Moss, so when Duke Johnson came, I picked up Duke Johnson. Now I've got the whole backfield. Now I got to figure out if I'm going to play one of them any given week or if I'm going to play two of them in a multi-flex league, which that's another study we're doing at Science of
Yeah.
Fantasy Football to see if playing both of the guys is a value. But handcuffs, I'll handcuff anybody because I don't
Yeah.
care. It's the whole theory of handcuffing your opponent's running back instead of your own doesn't make any sense. Give me good handcuffs. And here's the
Yeah.
thing about handcuffs too: is not all handcuffs are equal. The typical handcuff, and this was a study again I did from 2016 to 2019, so it's a little dated, but I did it pre-COVID, and I haven't done it since COVID started because now we're getting more running backs missing games due to COVID. But back in 2016 to 2019, we only had to worry about injuries like ACLs and then elbows and knees and everything else under the sun. Didn't have to worry about a sickness. The average handcuff scored 60% of an elite running back. So, in other words, if it was a top 10 running back that missed time, his replacement earned 60% of the points. It wasn't because he was 60%, only 60% the talent. It was because usually the dispersion of the opportunities didn't all go
Yep.
to him and it went
Yep.
to multiple players. But the value, his weekly value, is 60%.
Mm.
Alexander Madison's is 85% of
Mm.
Dalvin Cook. So not all handcuffs are equal.
Right. I have to say there is one handcuff situation I'm really intrigued by, and again, the handcuff is a rookie running back, but I love the situation, and he's playing with an RB1 who's known for getting injured, and that's Eckler and Spiller on the Chargers. I like that combination a lot. So, and I've got
And I
that.
like that.
That's
I like that combination because they've been
yeah,
trying to get Eckler fewer carries
yeah,
and more in the passing game and trying
yeah.
to give him fewer goal line carries. And nobody's done a damn good job at it. And they've
I
fed
know,
some really bad running backs out there
I
over
know,
and over again, trying to take volume away from
I know.
Eckler. And
I,
Spiller's a better three down back as
I
far
love
as
him.
some of these other guys. So yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I've noticed that when Eckler's down, I'm just kind of in the past when Eckler's been down, I'm kind of like my gaze averts away from the Chargers running back field there. But uh, I guess Sean, do you have any other questions besides that last one we have on our list there?
Um, so tell me a little bit about for the listeners who have never gone to scienceoffantasyfootball.com. Tell us a little about what they could find there, what they would be looking for there, the different things that you offer, and maybe what's coming in the future.
So at scienceoffantasyfootball.com, it is a messy laboratory where all the hard work is being done. And so it's not pretty, okay? But you'll have all the data that you need there, including I just lay out my complete process for you of how and why, and you can go all the way through my journey of figuring out how year end stats are lazy stats and weekly values are more of what we need in fantasy football. And I show you my process so you can do the math yourself or improve upon the process. See, that's what science is all about, folks. It's about this guy invents something and then the next five people make it better. Okay? The wheel was invented many centuries ago, but everybody's improving on making the wheels look better or perform better, the tires better. That only happens because all of that information got shared with the general public and they knew the knowledge. So when a new person starts in fantasy football, they don't have to start with how to invent the wheel in fantasy football. They can come to Science of Fantasy Football and I'll explain to you my journey and why my process works. and then you can decide if you want to improve it. Similarly, the professor has all of his lesson plans there. All these videos that are great, whether you're a novice in fantasy football or brand new, you can head on over there. All of that data is there. And then during the season, we're going to have data on the updated weekly values. We'll have my deep sleepers for Dynasty as far as waiver pickups. We'll have our redraft pickups as well. And the professor will have the continuing saga about the games over median and all the crazy stuff that comes into the professor's mind because he is a brilliant guy after all. But you also find all the links to our podcasts over there as well. And then on the Data Lab podcast, you can find that over on For Frequency's Sake, a pretty cool eclectic mix of a bunch of cool podcasts. But Science of Fantasy Football, it is not meant to be pretty. It is all meant to be the science laboratory. And you can find all the data you want over there. And most of the data will be free. I'm still deciding whether I want to put some behind a paywall, but I will probably offer way too much for free.
There's nothing wrong with earning a few bucks for hard labor, even if it's a passion. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
No, I'm all for capitalism, guys.
Same here.
But
Same
but
here.
I show the entire process, so actually somebody could take and rip off my ideas all they want and put them to work for them, and I'm fine with that. I don't even care if you give me credit. Just go ahead and don't say anything nasty about me when I spout off about how year-end stats are lazy stats. Boy, that's
Yeah,
gotten people fired up.
I love it. We're all going to steal Dennis's ideas and not give him credit and make ourselves look like geniuses.
That's all right.
That's
Just
how it
just I
works.
just identify yourself when you're playing
Just
against me in
just like
a
they
in a
messed over
$100
Tesla
league.
when they screwed over Tesla. All right,
Uh,
guys. Sean, any additional questions?
So the final question that we have, because we've had a number of guests on in the past month or so, and generally the one sort of common thread is the Scott Fishbowl. So the question that I would have is, how did you feel about your team this year, and how? So little history of you in the Scott Fishbowl. Is this your first year, your fifth year, that sort of thing, and then how you felt about your particular team?
this is my second year playing in the Scott Fish Bowl, and last year was a disaster. Last year, I violated the first rule of fantasy football in that I did not do enough research into the rules of the league that make it more unique than the leagues that I was in. It was just a busy summer, and I got lazy, and I got my butt kicked last year. And the worst part of my team last year is I did not, for some crazy reason, realize that I needed to start three wide receivers. I thought I could start one, two, whatever. And I did not realize I had to play a three wide receiver minimum lineup. And so this year I have rectified that problem by having a bunch of guys that I think I got at value who are also really strong wide receivers. Last year, I also made the mistake of taking Michael Thomas, and well, that worked out well. And I also had Gabriel Davis on my lineup in my lineup last year because I believed the hype last year. And I
Mhm.
also did not use my position scarcity index in the Scott Fish Bowl last year, but I used it this year. How is my team? It's going to be dependent on how many games Deshaun Watson is suspended. When the initial suspension of 6 games came, I thought I had a league winner here because I took Watson late in the draft and as my third quarterback. I've got Baker Mayfield as my second quarterback. I'm not sure I'll even start him with the unique rules. I'll maybe take a wait and see. But I got Patty Mahomes as my number one quarterback, and his completion percentage will not hurt me in the Scott Fish Bowl with the special rules. And then I've got, I went quality at running back with Mixon, Fournette, Javante Williams, uh, and then I went potential upside. I did take Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but I got him almost as cheap as I could get him in any league. I took Robinson with Jacksonville, and then I took Zamir White and Kyron Williams. Again, rookies late. Rookies late is always
Yeah.
the way to go. On the wide receiver side, I'm feeling good with Metcalf, the Sun God, Waddle, and Juju as my four wide receivers that I'll have in the starting lineup every week. And then I went for value. I went for upside. I mean, is Kenny Galladay going to be alive this year? If so, he's on
I
my
can only hope
team.
so.
I have no clue. And then I
Me
said
neither.
somebody has to catch the ball in Atlanta other than Kyle Pitts. And what if the rookie can't get it done? So I, believe it or not, took Brian Edwards with a late pick, figuring somebody's got to catch the ball. And then I added two rookies because I got David Bell and I got Velus Jones. I know Velus Jones is just about ready to collect Social Security, but I like his chances because he again has no competition. I would have liked a better tight end. That's where my team is weak. But I've got Freermuth and I got two rookies in Dulcich and Bellinger. So
Yeah.
will
I like
one of
Dulcich.
those? Yeah, will one of the rookies come through? I don't know. I don't think they're going to be all that valuable, but I'm not planning on
Mhm.
starting anybody but Freermuth at tight end. I got sniped on just about every tight end that I had a good feel for. I was at the end of a draft. I was drafting really late at the end, so I was at 10th. So it was a long way back to tight end, and I guessed wrong a couple of times on guys that I thought would drop, and I got sniped. And that's the big danger in Scott Fishbowl because you're going up against some really good players.
That's
So
what
I
I hear.
I think I'll have a winning record this year. That's my goal is to not embarrass myself and the new website.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My goal was just to, so I was in the division of my hometown. My goal is really only to win my division. Our draft was relatively chalky, so I sort of went with ADP, which was helpful because I more or less knew where to pick players if I wanted them. But there weren't any sort of like drastic drops. Now, the one thing that I did see is there's wild fluctuations between ADP and the live drafts where they only had a minute and a half, and then the slow drafts where they had 8 hours.
Yes. Yeah, there was a big difference. And
Mm.
if you look at I looked at some of the other leagues that drafted within the divisions that I can see, and boy, oh boy, there's a lot of fluctuation on players. There's a lot of smart people in the Scott Fishbowl, and there's a lot of good strategies. And I like the fact that the rules every year change. So if you're not really good at picking up on the slight little deviations of the rules, you're in trouble. I did not go with any kickers this year, which is kind of interesting. I saw the value of the kickers and how in this format they produce points, but I just at the positions that the good kickers went, I just couldn't justify their pick because I need to start running backs and wide receivers. I need to have some flexibility there. I don't need to start a kicker. So I needed some flexibility. I would have taken some late, but there was always somebody else there that I liked better at that position in the draft. So it'll be
Yeah.
interesting. If I lose Watson for the full year, then I'm playing one quarterback all season, and that might cost me some points. But feeling pretty good about my depth at running back and wide receiver to be able to hold on for a decent year.
All right. All right. All right. Well, Sean, any additional questions? All right. Yeah, it's a wrap over here too. So, Dennis, you've given us almost 2 hours of your time. So I really appreciate it. I hope you had nothing planned, nothing, no big family plans this Sunday. I hope so. We hope we didn't eat into any of your family plans at all. But thanks for giving us like an hour and 45 minutes of your time. It's been a great talk. I really appreciate it. And again, to all the viewers out there, Dennis Michaelson is again. You can find him at I'm sorry, is it at it's at DM. I'm sorry. First of all, the website is Science of Fantasy, and the Twitter handle is at sci_ff, as you'll see down here, and his Twitter handle is at DMIC Media. Dennis, any parting thoughts at all?
No, guys, enjoyed the discussion as always, and I do enjoy the podcast when I'm not on it too. So it was fun to visit with
I hear
y'all
you.
today.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Dennis. We really appreciate it. All right, Sean, have a great day. Dennis, take care. Thank you so much for joining us again. And everyone, we are out of here. Have a great rest of your Sunday and rest of your weekend. Take care, everyone.